So, I want to talk about a model of interpretation of embedded stories. But before I do that, I want to thank the organizers for having me here. And very especially, I want to thank them for keeping this event going for so many years. I think it's very important that we have this kind of event and narrative. And there are really no others like it. So thank you very much. Okay, so the reason why I started working on this interpretation of embedded stories comes from is an outcome of a long time working on story generation. So for 20 years, I've been building programs that create stories. And the sad truth is that the stories that come out are usually very disappointing. I've tried using different algorithms for this from many different areas of AI, and still they don't work really well. So at some point, I started thinking maybe the problem was not in the algorithms, but in the representation I was using for narratives. And to test this, I decided to try and transcribe some stories that I thought were good into the representation that I was using, and it immediately became apparent that the representations were falling short of what the stories hold in them. Because good stories are not flat. We have this impression that the stories are a sequence of discourse, and indeed they are in the form that we get them. But when we interpret them, our mind is building a much more complex representation. And unless you have a computational representation that can sort of at least mirror the important aspects, this is not going to work, especially in terms of generation. You still get a flat discourse, but that flat discourse that you're getting, it doesn't show the complexity of the narrative in the way that human written stories do. So I identified the problem as having a representation that can deal with embedding. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to try to keep everything at the intuitive level, and I'm going to talk about the intuitions and the stories and not really go into the definitions. You can find the definitions and the references to official narratological literature in the paper. But here, I just want to keep it simple. So imagine I'm telling you a story about these two characters, and as the story goes on, one of the characters starts telling a story to the other. Now, this second story is inside the story I was telling you, and it's an embedded story. And in this context, the story I was telling you becomes the frame story for the embedded story. Of course, this can go on recursively because the characters inside the embedded story might themselves start telling a story, and so on. So this is the kind of structure that needs to be represented. And this process of shifting one level in, it needs to be addressed computationally as well. So having said that, this is a small summary of what I want to tell you. I'll go a little deeper into the idea of embedded stories, but again, using an example, not that much theory. Then I'll describe the little model that I have built, which is indeed the first approximation, but I think it holds the basics that need to be addressed by any later, more elaborate models. And then I'll discuss how these insights that arise from this can be seen and what they say about particular examples. And then I'll just review some takeaway messages. Okay, so to think about embedded stories, I picked a very classic work that is the essence of embedding in literature, which is the Arabian Nights, which, as you know, is one very long story that has a lot of little stories inside. So if you actually look at this, we all know the story. I'll be going through the actual text, but I've extracted the bits that seem relevant, and I'm superimposing on these colored frames that represent the different narrative levels. So this is the blue frame is the general frame story of the whole book. And as you move down, basically this is, you all know the story, but just to make, for completeness, this is an instance of the overcoming the monster classic plot, where the monster is this king that every night takes to bed a virgin girl and then kills her in the morning, has her killed in the morning. And the hero is Scheherazade, who happens to be able to tell very interesting stories. So Scheherazade convinces her father that to let her take on this king, and to set the tone for the book, the father, who's of course very worried, tries to convince her that this is not a good idea, and he does this by telling her a story. And then you can see the first embedded story appearing here. This green frame is the story that the father is telling. The story finishes, but doesn't achieve its purpose. So Scheherazade decides to go and meet the king, but she is not going in blind. She agrees with her little sister to show up at some point and basically let know the king that Scheherazade tells very interesting stories. So the king says, "Oh yes, please tell me a story," and she does. So we get a second frame at this first level, which is at the tale, the story that Scheherazade is going to tell on the first night. Now she's very smart, so just in case one story not being enough, she inside the story starts a second story, which guarantees that when the morning comes, she has not one but two stories unfinished. And this creates a lot of tension, and indeed the king is fooled by this and decides to not kill her that morning and wait until the next evening so she can finish the story, which is basically the key of the key narrative mechanism of the book, which allows her to tell lots of stories. Okay, so this is a small representation of the structure of nesting that we're getting in that small fragment. The book is several volumes and has a lot of stories. I don't really know if they're actually 1001, but there's probably more because of these embeddings, that some of the nights, the stories that are told have stories in them. And it actually goes quite deep sometimes. Anyway, so you get here the concepts of the embedded story and the frame story. Embedded story is the one that's put inside another story, and the frame story is the one where the embedded story is inserted. So with these terms, I can now start describing the model. And the model, when I sat down to do this, I came up with a number of challenges that need to be faced by any model trying to solve this problem. The first one is actually having to identify from the discourse of a story, which, as we were saying, is flat, it's just a sequence of statements. You need to be able to identify where an embedded story is starting, and this is not trivial. Then you need a representation of the story that shows this kind of level that we've just seen, this kind of nesting structure of boxes inside boxes, so that a simple story is just one box, but any story with more than one level has several boxes, some inside the others. And finally, we need some dynamic description of how we go from a linear sequence, that is the discourse, to this nested structure. Now, as I said before, I'm really more interested in the representation of narrative, because what I really want to achieve is good generation of good stories. So the actual interpretation of the text is not of much interest to me, so I've cheated a little. What I've done is it's a bit like those cookery programs. So I'm starting with a solution that is partly there. Here's one that I prepared earlier. So I get, I'm using stories that are not really text, but represented as a sequence of predicate argument structures. So they are a sequence, and they are similar to the real discourse in the sense that this is a linear sequence that we're getting, but I don't need to deal with parsing the actual text. To actually ensure that this contains the information that I need, I've added to the notation some devices to mark the beginning of an embedded story and the end as well. And then over this, I can address the issues of what data structures would be needed to represent this interpretation, and what are the computational implications of these elements in terms of the procedure that we would need for the interpretation process. So, as I say, I've sort of sidelined the issue of identifying the embedded stories from the text. If you go back and look at the example of the Arabian Nights that I showed in the slides, I have tried to underline in black some of the elements in the text that I consider to be relevant cues for identifying the structure. But a lot of what needs to be done involves complex inference about who's talking and which of the previous levels the characters talking belong to. So for the discourse, this is the representation language I'm using for the input. This is a linear sequence of statements. These were basically, as I said at the beginning, these are the representation language I was using to represent the output of the generators, with a few additions to represent the complexity. So this is an example of an embedded story occurring within a longer discourse, and you can see it has this specific statement for the start of the story. Then it is followed by the sequence of statements that actually describe the embedded story, and also a final predicate which acts as a marker for the end of the embedded story, but also doubles up as the representation of the insertion point of the embedded story into the frame story. This is where in the frame story we are told that someone is telling a story, and it also has who's telling the story and who's listening to the story, or who's being addressed. And both of these statements are linked together by the name of the story, which comes as an argument and acts as a unique identifier for the story. So this is the setup. This is what would have to be obtained from the text to be at the point where we can now apply the interpretation procedure and the representation procedure that we need. And the representation we want to achieve, I'm going right down to the Java code, because I thought that was the most informative way of describing this. This is the implementation of a narrative interpretation for a story. It has a story name, which corresponds to the one we've seen appearing as argument. It has a representation of the linear sequence of statements that describes the story at this level, the narrative at this level, but it also has this data structure which holds a set of embedded stories, or may hold. This may be empty, of course. If the story is simple, this is empty, but if there's an embedded story, it will be stored here. And it's the way these are stored here is as narrative interpretations themselves. So this is where the recursion comes in, and there may be several, as we've seen in the example of the Arabian Nights. So each one needs to be indexed, and the index, this string appearing here as index for this map, is what actually links the embedded stories that are held in the map with the point where they appear in the discourse of the frame story. So, and again, an example here on the left, we have the discourse, and which is flat, but on the right we have the interpretation, and this has the frame story, and which for the actual frame story is still a sequence of events describing what's happening, but some of these events actually include a reference to an embedded story, which is itself a different instance of narrative interpretation that gets stored in the map. I've tried to replicate the sequence of colors for the progressively embedded stories all throughout, so in case this helps to understand the intuitions behind it. Okay, so in terms of the procedure, and this is where it gets a little complex, but this is like the pseudocode for the algorithm I'm proposing. And what happens is when you start interpreting a story, you initialize both a draft for the story itself, which is this narrative interpretation, which has the map of additional narrative interpretations inside it, and both are empty, and there's a stack which is used to keep track of context. As you progress through the discourse for the frame story, you're basically adding the statements describing the events in the interpretation, but when you and this sort of grows progressively, and if it's a simple story, this is all that will happen. But if you find a start of story, then the interpretation to this point is shifted to the stack, and you create a new empty one because you need a new context to interpret the embedded story. And then you go on, and basically you have now moved into the part of the flat discourse that refers to the embedded story. So you process that, and you're now adding it in the same way, but to the interpretation for the embedded story, until you get to the point where you reach the end of the story. And at that point, a number of things need to happen, which is you need to recover the context of interpretation. Was the frame story. You need to store the interpretation you now have of the embedded story inside the interpretation for the frame story. And finally, you need to add a statement to the frame story that says X tells the story to Y, and the story which has a pointer to the interpretation of the embedded story that you now have in your map of embedded stories. So this is what happens. And I wanted to show you this happening over real examples, but of course, to do this, I needed to have representations of the stories in the kind of notation that I have used. And I only had those for two different domains. One is the Russian folk tales described in Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folktale, which I had been using as inspiring set for some of my generators. And for one of those, this is a longer story, but I've picked out one of the narrative threads within that, which is, again, an instance of overcoming the monster plot, where you get the hero, which in this case is brother 2, and someone tells him, and it doesn't say who in the story, that's why there's an X. This is the general frame of the story. Someone tells the hero that the princess has been kidnapped. The hero decides to react, goes fight the dragon, but is wounded in the process. So the princess is rescued, but the hero cannot show up to claim credit. So someone else does. I save the princess by telling a false story. And what happens is when the hero recovers and appears, exposes this false hero in Prop's terminology, and basically by letting everyone discover the real story. So the interesting thing here is first that even for very simple stories like these, there are embedded stories. But not only that, the embedded stories that appear here are quite important for the plot. They actually drive the plot. They actually determine the shape of the whole plot. And that was relevant for me. It's also true that some of them are not necessarily true. Some of them are actually false and actually contradictory versions of the same set of events. Another important point here is that some of these stories are actually retellings of fragments of what has happened before. And that is important for some of the things I'll say later in the discussion. Okay, so this did work, and it showed some interesting results for the Russian folktales, but I wanted to make sure that it was also relevant in a more general sense. And I did have another potential source to use as input, because I'm currently working in this project, which is about 18th century Italian opera, and working together with musicologists and us, and is trying to study the music and the narrative of these operas. So these are opera seria, and the one I'm showing you, which is one I had for which I had the encoding, is Artaserse, which is about a Persian king, and this is a sketch of only the beginning of the first act, because it is a much longer discourse. So you can see the frame story, and this is the whole the story is basically the key to the story is a conspiracy to exterminate the ruling royal family and place a different person on the throne. And the villain is Artabano, and he wants to place his own son Arbace in the throne. So the story starts with Artabano meeting Arbace, and actually Artabano tells Arbace that he's just killed the king, which shocks the man, and he leaves. But then Artaban actually tells the audience in this sort of trick used by this kind of opera, tells the audience about his plan, which is to kill everybody in the royal family and make sure his son gets to be king. To achieve this, he goes to the Artaserse, who was the son of the eldest son of the king, and tells him that Dario, who is his younger brother, actually killed their father, and the story gets spread. So this is someone else telling the same story to other people, and this actually leads to Dario being executed for supposedly having killed his father. And then the plot begins to thicken, because someone considers that maybe it wasn't Dario who killed the king, and so on. And that's how the story goes on. There's two things that I found interesting here. One is, again, that there are embedded stories here. They are very relevant to the plot. In fact, they actually play a very important role in the story or in the play, because although it's a very violent story, no violence actually takes place on stage. Whenever there's violence, it happens somewhere else, and someone comes in and describes it by telling a story. There's another element that I found very interesting here, which is that if you actually superimpose on this view of the first act, the scene changes whenever people actually leave or come in. It appears that in almost every scene, there's someone who tells a story. So apparently the scenes are all about someone telling story to someone else. And I found that pretty interesting. So moving on to the discussion, and I think there's a number of obvious limitations to this model as it stands, being, as I said, only a first approximation. The first one is that it assumes that the embedded stories are always told as a single span. As I showed you, the way to represent embedded stories in the discourse only allows for a start story marker and an end of story marker. So you can't stop them halfway and then open them up again, which is something that obviously happens a lot in real stories. In fact, you can see in Arabian Night, that's the way every story works, because they are all told in 2 nights, and in between, Sherazad at dawn stops the story without having finished, and then we have a little something that describes how that this has happened and how the day passes, and then the story is retaken. So this needs to be added to the model in some way. Another limitation is that when I was working on these, I was working from synopsis of the plots rather than full text. So, and this means that sometimes this obscures the issue of narrative distance. So we don't really know. We know that someone is learning about a story, but we don't actually know whether it is someone else actually telling them the story, or whether they discover from something else that they have learned, and that again would need to be looked into more carefully. But it links in with another issue, which is the current version assumes that all the stories, whether they are the framing story or the embedded story, are told in chronological order. And we know that real stories as told by people don't usually do that, or not necessarily do that, because we have flashbacks and flash forwards, or things that were told in interesting orders. Now, of course, that is a separate problem that would also need to be addressed. This is just a simple model for this problem, and there are many others related to narrative that would have to come together into a more elaborate version. But the interesting thing, as we have seen in the examples, sometimes these kind of flashback or references to something that happened before, someone like the hero, the real story of the hero being told at the end to unmask and expose the false hero, they are actually references to something that happened in the text earlier. So in a sense, they are a flashback. So this same framework might actually be useful to represent anachrony as part of a more complex system. And finally, in terms of conclusions, I want to say the main conclusion here is not, hey, problem solved. Rather, it's this is an important open problem that still needs a lot of work. However, I can say that the model that I have proposed, it does provide a computational framework that captures the nested structure, and it uses a stack to represent the way in which the context for interpretation of each narrative level can be recovered in the right order as we come back from the nesting. And it allows for representing the embedded stories as part of the interpretation of the frame story, but not at the same level of discourse, rather as a specific embedded structure that also allows for more than one embedded story to happen, and it can be embedded recursively. Please keep in mind that this is just the first approximation. I'm not claiming that this is the solution, just that the solution, when it comes, and it will be much more complex, has to look something like this. In that sense, there's obviously a lot of further work to do, especially and very relevant to this workshop. We need to consider how to get from the text to the kind of input discourse that I am using, in which the embedded stories are explicitly marked with a start and end, and that is not trivial at all, as it involves a lot of inference. And I mean, in the Arabian Nights, there are very clear cases where the stories are labeled. They have a big title, and someone says, "I'm now going to tell you a story, the story of the ass and the bull," or whatever. But that's not always so easy. It's not always typographically marked. And in some cases, in the paper, I do consider the case of The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which is a different, again, a different genre and a longer novel, where there is also an embedded story, but the frame story is very, very short, and it just acts as a literary device to introduce the main story, which is embedded within it. And it's actually very, very tricky in that one to identify the transition points between one and the other, and what is a comment to the embedded story from the frame story, and what is actually just additions to the embedded story. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.